Hello,
Okay.
everyone. We're going to get started in just a minute.
Hey, Heather,
Oh, there she is. Text is sending them.
we're just sending you another link. Gave us a little anxiety.
Sorry, I knew the back-to-back was gonna be the issue today, but I
Yeah,
had,
it happens. It happens. Well, I have a session coming up that I have to do in Korea, and I forgot, since it's been so long, that we are a day right ahead, right? So when they said Thursday, what they really meant was Wednesday. So I put it in my schedule for Thursday, and thankfully, this week I realized, oh no, I made a mistake. So, whew, that would have been awful. But yeah, well, it's great. Okay, well, we've got our crew on. We've got a good size, and we've got more coming. But glad to see everyone on. And Ava, why don't you take it away?
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the second policy forum of the Coalition for Career Development Center in the 22-23 academic year. Thank you to our sponsors who made this possible, American Student Assistance and the Education Strategies Group. I am Ava Mitchell, the Chief Program Officer at the Coalition, and I am thrilled to introduce today's topic: designing and implementing career pathway strategies that are responsive to industry needs and enable social mobility for all youth and young adults. It is the mission of the Coalition to make career development for all students the #1 priority of American education. That cannot be accomplished unless policies and practices ensure all students have quality career readiness programming and support. To promote equity, we must provide access to academic and career planning, work-based learning opportunities, career development technology, and qualified staff that understand the diverse needs of people facing unique challenges. This panel will discuss current efforts to ensure career readiness and access. First, I would like to welcome one of the Coalition's distinguished board members, Paul Perkins, CEO of Amatrol. He'll be providing an industry perspective to reflect on panelists' remarks in the conclusion of today's policy forum. Acting as panel co-moderator, I would also like to welcome Dr. Scott Solberg, our Coalition's Vice President of Research Initiatives. Dr. Solberg is a highly recognized global expert on career development and future readiness with deep knowledge of implementation across the United States. He is also the director of the Boston University Center for Future Readiness and a professor of counseling psychology and applied and human development at the BU Wheelock College of Education and Human Development. Dr. Solberg will have the privilege of introducing our very special guests, who are all in strategic positions to ensure career readiness access. Scott?
Well, thank you. So really excited, privileged to be able to have a chance to talk with Luke Rhine, our Deputy Assistant Secretary of Education for the Office of Career, Technical, and Adult Education and our U.S. Department of Ed. And I'll come back and introduce a little bit more about Luke, but I also want to recognize that we're going to also follow up with some conversation with Kate Kreamer, who's the Deputy Executive Director, Advanced CTE, Heather Justice, Director of Career Readiness at the Education Strategy Group, to learn about some really exciting efforts they're doing in 6 communities around the country. So we're going to have a great time with that. But I just wanted to say, Luke, it's so fun to be able to talk with you at this level. I mean, we met when you were out at Delaware and just leading such an amazing effort in making the career technical education efforts in Delaware to becoming one of the strongest we have in the country. And I know we did a case study with your state last year to really look at the interconnection that you were doing around social emotional learning, around the personalized career and academic plans, around and around the career tech ed, and so much of it, even now moving into the middle school grades, you've just been in that leading effort. So the chance to talk with you now as the Assistant Secretary, when we know you've got a really good sense of how this works on the ground, but now you're taking it up to national policy. I can't think of a better person to have talking with us today. So thank you and welcome, Luke.
Oh, thank you. It's absolutely my pleasure. And I'm excited.
All right.
Let's start off with hearing from you about how OCTAE defines career pathways, Luke.
Yeah, so this is going to be a pretty standard definition because we all kind of sing from the same song sheet across the federal family. But essentially, I'm going to reference WIOA and the definition of a career pathway in WIOA, which is, and I'm like quoting, a combination of rigorous and high quality education, training, and other services. And then there's like a list of things that are included within a career pathway that include things like alignment to industry, prepares individuals to be successful in a full range of both post-secondary and secondary opportunities, including registered apprenticeships. It includes counseling as well as other support services that help individuals to achieve their education and career goals. It includes appropriate education offered concurrently, so within the context of the workforce and as a way to accelerate one's journey towards a particular career or occupation. It organizes training and services that meet the particular needs of people, and it enables people to earn credentials that matter. So starting with high school diploma to post-secondary credentials that have value in the labor market, and then progressing through to degrees. And then the very last one is it's organized around industry. So programs help people to enter both jobs as well as progress within a career.
So you mentioned the WIOA, the standard definition there. And I know obviously we have the Perkins and things like that. And when we start talking about pathways, we're starting to talk about pathways as pathways, right? This idea that every student needs to be thinking about how they're going to organize their education opportunities, their after high school, whether it's training, whether it's a 2-year or 4-year, whatever those pathways are in that way, but that they're all leading towards a meaningful work, and hopefully work that's going to increase for many of our youth, their social mobility going forward. So how do you see this starting to play out in some of these other federal, the other federal agencies? And I'm thinking like it could be the Higher Ed Act, the ESSA. Are you seeing that the pathway conceptual frame is moving forward through these areas as well, these policies?
Yeah, I do. And I think Scott, I'll use your language, like the definition of a career pathway more than anything, particularly in federal legislation, it's a framework. And it's a framework to how we can think about education. And more than anything, it's a framework that allows us to organize education to essentially span the component parts of our K-12 higher ed workforce and economic development systems. And I think, where I would kind of push, my particular definition of a career pathway, it is to essentially ensure that learning is cumulative across one's life cycle, and that there are not these starts and stops that we arbitrarily define within different sections of our education or workforce system. And that, again, learning is cumulative, it's progressive. And frankly, there are linkages that are established to help people navigate transition. So whether that's transition from high school to higher education, whether that's transition into an apprenticeship program, whether that's transition from a post-secondary credential into the workforce, we essentially need to ensure that people are at the center of our instructional design, and that we work across federal and state programs to ensure that one's education and skill is cumulative in their development, and it progresses over their lifetime.
Awesome.
So I like the way you said you
Louder.
work to make sure that people are at the center of the design of pathways. Can you talk a little bit about what it means to keep diverse people at the center of that design, whether they have disabilities, whether they come from a socioeconomic status where they might not have exposure, or they might have interruptions from their lives that prevent the continuity of education and progression along their pathway, as you were just speaking?
Sure. So I'll speak about equity as a design principle, but I'll also give some examples about work that we led in Delaware that really looked at student income, low-income communities, as well as students with other barriers to continuing education and employment, particularly like students with disabilities. So equity is not our goal, or equity is our goal. It's also a design principle. So it's something that we have to intentionally build for from the onset when we create instructional programs and we create opportunities for young people. So the work that I led in Delaware really tried to position students and employers as kind of the co-designers of our education to employment system. Those were the two voices in the room that mattered most in terms of how we build infrastructure around young people and their future employers. And our hope was to essentially make sure that we were intentional in the design of that program so that it opened doors. Essentially, career pathways were an opportunity multiplier, so that we were intentionally dividing, we were intentionally creating opportunities that allowed people to take active steps in that progression. So I'll talk about specific pieces of legislation and federal policy that we tried to pull together. So, one even that you mentioned is really around students with disabilities. And there are many different federal programs that support students with disabilities. So, right, there's ESSA, there's IDEA, there's Perkins, there's also Title IV of WIOA, vocational rehabilitation. And these are often run in isolation of one another. What we tried to do at the state level was essentially center those programs in schools and around students who needed to access those services. This is true for services around health and social services as well. And we wanted to use schools and our community colleges as like a central delivery mechanism for both student supports, social and emotional learning, as well as strong and rigorous academic and technical education. And I think as we look across, different federal programs, states and localities have a lot of work that can be done to essentially move those things together and make sure that those programs and services are a little bit more proximate to people.
That's awesome. That's awesome. And by the way, people, those of you listening, use the chat box, throw in some questions
I love it.
that you would like Luke to be able to answer. So we're going to have some time for that. So definitely throw those in. And I know we've got Robin helping us behind here, looking at the chat and responding. So she'll let us know. So question I had, and I loved what you were saying earlier about this. What I was hearing were words like, we need relevance, continuity, and also a strategic, there's a strategy that I'm learning things that are leading me towards a particular outcome. And it could be credential, but whatever's going to help me get enter that particular occupational arena, which is really exciting. When you think about that, what would you see as some of the key components of a career pathway, and not just in the sense of a traditional CTE, but if you're redesigning the school around a pathway system, what would you like to see in place, starting in middle school and then kind of moving all the way through that high school into the 2-year? What would you like to see in that?
Yeah, so I think I want to talk about middle school specifically, because I think this is both an area for innovation as well as like research and development.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll start with middle school and then I'll move into upper secondary or high school. And in middle school specifically, I would push us well beyond the norm of what's traditionally defined as middle school CTE. And essentially, I was a middle school teacher, I was a middle school special ed teacher, and I was a middle school CTE teacher. So in middle school particularly, it's about the development of the individual and helping that young person find their future trajectory and identify who they want to become. And we have to center the person in terms of their both intellectual development, their cognitive development, and essentially envisioning themselves beyond their current reality. Mm-hmm. And the person is the most important thing in terms of like a middle school design. So I think it really is around advisement. It really is around coaching. It is around social and emotional learning in terms of navigating, who I am in context of my environment, who I am in context of my future workplace, how I regulate, how I act, how I behave, how I speak. All of those things are learned behaviors, and they're socialized norms essentially in terms of how we build, that level of skill. But then I would also push pretty heavily on academic and technical subject expertise and the development of skill. So things like communications, things like the ability to write, things like the ability to work as a team, right? Those are also skills that, irregardless of the career area or industry that you move into, they have strong reciprocity. There's a lot of transfer, and there's skills that you will essentially work on for the rest of your life. And I think I would isolate kind of those 3 parts. So really academic and technical education, social and emotional learning, and then strong student advisement and the establishment of trajectory, as well as just being very comfortable with self. And those are kind of the 3 areas that I would love to see our field kind of push into, kind of this middle school kind of career pathways space. Mm-hmm. And middle school in my mind is really about exploration. It's really about awareness. It's about understanding what it is that I want to move into and having the skill set and the capacity to navigate that system so that I can articulate that as well as take that next step. And it's about, many high schools right now are taking on substantial reform around career pathways and around rethinking college and career models within those schools. But for students to take advantage of that instructional programming and that opportunity, they really have to be aware of the system, how the system is evolving, and they have to be equipped to access that service as early as day one, their freshman year.
Mhm.
And this idea of high school readiness, being ready for upper secondary, is something that I think we really need to spend time on in terms of middle grades preparation, and helping the student become their best self.
Mhm.
In terms of high school and high school career pathways specifically, I think our high schools have the potential to be incubators of talent. So essentially, high school can be an opportunity multiplier for young people. And I think there are things that really help to set people up, over the course of their lifetime. So just a couple weeks ago, I'm very excited that we announced a new initiative, which is called Raising the Bar, Unlocking Career Success. There are essentially 4 cornerstones of that initiative that I think are reflected in strong high school design. So the first is really student access to dual enrollment. So it's using post-secondary credit and ensuring the alignment between K-12 curriculum and higher education, particularly in academic and technical areas. So helping students work through their first collegiate math and English language arts course, as well as a strong focus in career and technical education and other career-focused curriculum. The second area is around student advisement and navigation. And it's moving away from counseling, perhaps, to really more coaching. So helping the person develop their ideas, develop their articulation of their sense of self and what they want to become, as well as helping them navigate which steps are in their control in terms of how they, move left or move right or move straight ahead. And it's about having a coach. So someone who can really sit down, knows what you want, and can help you to build and stack the types of experiences that you need to accomplish that.
Mhm.
The third thing is really high quality work-based learning. And this takes many different shapes from just industry tours as well as industry mentors. I think mentorship is a huge part of where we should build in terms of work-based learning. But I also think that on-the-job work experience is absolutely essential for young people. And it's kind of that the balance of knowing what to do and knowing how and where to apply those skills.
Mhm.
And this gives us space to essentially think about application, to think about knowledge transference, as well as to build social capital and social networks that help people to navigate the industry or given occupation, as well as wage growth.
Mhm.
And then the last piece is really around credentials. So it's focusing on credentials beyond a high school diploma that help to signal an individual's skill and signal for both employers and institutions of higher education that this individual has the right set of competencies, the right skill set to move beyond high school in a way that is both conducive to the employer, the school, and the person. So I think from a high school perspective, those are, I think, some of the 4 pillars that we'd really like to see across the board for every young person.
And I think also that when you talk about that on the job kind of experience, it's also important because it gives them more self-exploration. They really get to try on. We've seen a young woman who went in to do a dietitian certificate to start working in a hospital, and that gave the opportunity to look around the hospital and see all the other kinds of things they might like to do, and came back and did all the science and math to go into a nursing pathway. So the idea that it's just about getting the skills to be in work, it's actually also really confirming, or maybe I'm not wanting to work with blood and I didn't realize there was a lot of blood involved or something, whatever might also move them into some other options. Really like what you just said, though, too, about the idea of talent. And I've been, in some of my talks, I talk about schools really being a talent development enterprise. And how are we taking what the students really interested in, helping support them? And I've really seen a lot of great things going on around maker spaces and entrepreneurial kinds of skills development as a way of really letting youth kind of drive that process. But I also like this focus on mentoring, and I've stopped with the idea of advising and guidance, and we're talking about facilitating. But the good research showing that when they have a meaningful career conversation with an educator, their future wage earnings go way up. So this idea that we really need to have youth having someone that they can really think through and talk through, and it doesn't have to be one-on-one. I think it's even better when it's in a small group setting. So some really exciting stuff there. But then the question I have for you is, I've been really getting excited about how we can help youth look at different opportunities that they know nothing about. They don't have any sense of whether they're capable at those, and give them some kind of an opportunity to learn about it. So one of Paul and I's colleagues at our CCD center, Roger Tedeschi, grabbed me and brought me over to do a welding virtual reality training program that simulates the exact skills and can actually, with the score I had, which wasn't good, but if it were good, would be indicating that I'm ready to move into a welding type of occupation. Now, of course, you never get it right on the first try. So yes, I can keep practicing. But the idea that I could be in a virtual reality space practicing something I know nothing about, nothing that I know about it, and get excited seems to me like something we should be starting in middle and early high school to really expand the relevance and a sense of what's possible as I start going through. And I'm just wondering about, from your standpoint, what are you seeing as some of these kind of innovative strategies to help youth begin considering the pathways? The pathway is a structure. We've got employers ready, we've got the training ready, but we need people to be entering with a sense of what this is about and an excitement. So just wanted to get your take on that.
Yeah, so I think some of the virtual reality stuff is really pretty neat. So we're going to pull a Delaware experience. So we used to host every year what was referred to as the Governor's Construction or the Governor's Career Expo. So there were a number of employers, and one specific part was around construction careers. So I think my daughter, who's 10, had an experience where she was essentially on a virtual forklift and was kind of manipulating kind of that system. She thinks driving anything is like remarkably interesting. So she's kind of at that space. And that was a bit of a prerequisite before I put her on what was essentially like a front loader that they had in the parking lot. So, you know what I mean? It was a neat way in which where I was, talking to my daughter essentially about like, look here, you're going to learn some skills. I immediately want you to go apply those skills because like if you wreck the virtual forklift, whoop-de-doo, we're going to learn something. But if you know what I mean? I want you to put the basketball in the thing using kind of the front end loader.
Yeah.
And it was a neat thing for her because she never saw herself in either environment. And we had a neat conversation around like, does she have interest in, driving or operating a vehicle or like those types of things in terms of her career. And my conversation to her to that point had really been about healthcare careers because she's very much in the space of social responsibility and careers that help and careers that are focused on caring, which is neat. So I think the virtual reality piece is really neat. And I think it's a nice way in which we can create a lot of exposure, particularly at the right time. And we can let students kind of learn on their own pace.
Exactly.
But I also think things like job shadows, you know what I mean? Career speakers, career days, and mentorship go a long way. So I'll share like a personal example is I had worked in construction for high school through most of college. And it wasn't until, and I was actually volunteering at a 4-H camp where I taught kids like how to sail and kayak and stuff like that. It wasn't until I was in like my sophomore year in college when a person sat down and said, it seems like you're having a lot of fun at camp. Perhaps you should consider a career in education. And that was my excuse to then go see if I wanted to be a teacher. And turns out that was pretty awesome. And, I haven't really looked back. But it's remarkable just the advice that you can get both in a formal setting and if you're in the right context, how people can associate things that you may not see. So those are things that every young person should experience. And every young person should have a caring adult in their life who at different times is helping to push their thinking and push their definition of self.
And I know Ava's got the next question here, but I just want to say thank you. Love 4-H. I was a 4-H'er myself. Yay to 4-H. It was so much fun. I'm so proud to have been a member of that. But Ava.
Yeah, Luke, you talked a lot earlier about starting in middle school, having young people explore and develop an identity and envision beyond their current reality and skills. And I wanted to unpack that a little bit because that's essential for young people to have any chance of social mobility. And I'm wondering how you think about the role of education and work-based learning environments in deconstructing some of the limiting notions that students themselves might think about their own pathway, and others might think about the pathway for some students versus others.
Sure. So I think boil that down to like a 5-second question for me.
So when we think about young people exploring different kinds of careers, we want to make sure that not only are we exposing them to different careers, but we're also helping them to see that they have a place in those spaces. So for example, you were breaking serious gender notions with your daughter, right? When
Yes.
you were taking her up there. When we think about introducing young people to different pathways that maybe nobody else in their family has explored, right? This is a serious identity shift for them. And we think about bringing them into in work environments where they might be the only one. There are some different shifts that are needed both in the individual in that environment and also in the industry itself. What advice might you have for people working with young people, both on the education side and on the employer side?
Sure. So I think it's, Eva, to your point, it's education that's required with our school systems, and it's also education that's required with employers. And I think those two entities, more than anyone else, have to meet in the middle in terms of what a strong curated student experience looks like and what, both parties can receive as a result of that, what is a reciprocal relationship. So I think in terms of student awareness, we need to really make sure that we are exposing young people to different types of careers and different types of work environments. And I think there are a bunch of different ways to do that. We can bring people into schools. We can go out to the field. And I think creating space in the school day for that to occur is probably the prerequisite notion. In terms of helping young people to enter the world of work, I think we need to be very clear with young people about what we are preparing them for. And within different industries that are not as inclusive of others, we need to have a conversation with young people about what a good workplace looks like, how you should be valued in a workplace, and then what happens if you are not valued in a workplace, and what are the appropriate steps to move to resolution so that you can either solve that problem individually or a group of folks can solve that problem. But similarly, that same type of education needs to exist with employers, and specifically how to onboard a young person into their work environment. And this is true irregardless of the employee, but it's particularly true for young people because this is, in all respects, a make or break experience for that young person. Unless employers become very adept at onboarding all types of young people from different walks of life and different parts of our country, they are not going to solve their talent needs. And onboarding is kind of that first impression, and that is a lasting impression. And we need to make sure that employers specifically create environments where many different individuals can be successful in their companies. And it is not a one size fits all. Right? People are not robots. We are not creating an assembly line. That is not the work that we're doing. So I think it requires two parts. And I do think, there's states that have taken on some intermediary functions to help educate and train employers. And there's a couple different things that people can do to kind of create, those training models that help people, particularly the public and private sectors, to kind of meet in the middle.
And it sounds like your Delaware example where the students and employers were co-designers is one great example of how that kind of partnership created new opportunities, both for the students and also for the employers to learn about how to create the environments where their employees could be successful at pathways.
Absolutely.
So quick comment from Ann, and then I've got a question from Meredith I thought we'd pose up before. We want to also talk about some funding in just a minute, if you can, Luke. So Ann was talking about the idea that we need to give exposure to all the post-secondary options, right? Is a key. And I think, Luke, you would agree too, or at least we're, as a CCD center, we're advocating that every student has a plan for how they're going to leave high school and get a good paying job right out of high school. And they've got to have whatever credential or the steps to that. They need to understand the next steps to additional training, the 2-year options and the 4-year. And it's no longer these kids are going to college, these kids are going to work. Every single student has to be ready for all of these different and understand the lifelong pathway that they're about to journey on as they continue into adulthood. I wanted to see your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I think, education, there are a number of things that we try to accomplish through education, right? Being a responsible adult, being a practicing citizen, and moving into the world of work are like 3 of the things that education affords us. And really between high school and whatever form of post-secondary education the student wants to walk into, it really is about navigating that system and understanding the value of one's education relative towards your initial and long-term career goals. And, there's a statistic that many states use and is used nationally. It's, by 2027, it's 70% of jobs are going to require some type of post-secondary credential. Some of those will be bachelor's degrees. Some of those will be 2-year degrees. Some of those will be short and long-term credentials. Others will be apprenticeships. There isn't really a one-size-fits-all across given industries. And the type of credential that one acquires is often based on the industry that a person wants to enter. Right. So it's really understanding the industry. It's really understanding what credential has currency within that industry, and then being able to determine what best next step is right for me or right for the young person that's choosing their path.
Awesome. That's awesome.
Scott, to your point, every young person needs to have a plan for what they want to do beyond high school, like at a minimum. And then it's about steps to get there, and it's about having the social support to accomplish that goal. Right. So there are a number of things that we really need to equip young people with in terms of social capital.
Yeah. And I think it's a big shift when we think about then the secondary ed. It's not getting them to that next step. It's them leaving with a plan and an understanding about all the steps that are involved and how they can enter. And because sometimes they're going to start and stop, and there's going to be other on-ramps of opportunity. They just need to have that understanding, which is a big order compared to the history of just saying you've graduated and kind of now we're done. But I wanted to get to Meredith's question. They've been waiting patiently here to hear more about, as you're looking at Perkins, and I think this is a big issue around equity. I've heard it in states before. It's come up a lot in our state leaders network, but students with disabilities and how they're getting both access, but also encouragement around the CTE space. And so just wanted to get your thoughts about that.
Yeah, so I'll use a Delaware example, and we'll talk about some of the things that we tried to do. So I think I started in Delaware in 2014, and then we created a career pathway strategy in 2015. And when we were kind of sharing that career pathway strategy with different groups and individuals across the state, it was very clear that we did not account for students with disabilities as directly as we should in that state plan. That was essentially feedback that we got from the field. And it struck like a nerve in terms of how we think about supports for individuals with disabilities. So in Delaware, it's 15% of all youth in high school have some type of disability, whether it's cognitive or physical. And that is a significant percentage of young people, and that's true across most states. Labor force participation rates for individuals with disabilities are very low, as are graduation rates compared to the traditional student cohort. So essentially what we decided to do was we wanted to map all of the federal programs that exist to support young people with disabilities. And we wanted to see how proximate families and students were to those programs. So things like IDA came up, things like vocational rehabilitation came up, particularly pre-employment transition services in vocational rehabilitation. We looked at things like developmental and disability services. We looked at services for students who are blind or visually impaired, students who are deaf or hard of hearing, or students who need specific healthcare considerations, and they or their families had access or were accessible to via Medicaid. And what we essentially found when we talked with schools and practitioners is schools knew what IDEA was. That's it.
Mhm.
They did not know how to access voc rehab services. They did not know what offices or services health and social services offered. And they didn't know who to talk to in terms of how to advocate for their students to acquire those things.
Mhm.
And when we mapped kind of the student journey, so we physically talked to students with disabilities, and we talked about lived experience, and we talked about how proximate individuals and families were to these services, they were not proximate. So it was essentially 3 stops along a thing, and I might be able to acquire a pre-employment transition service that works for me. Our push then was to essentially position schools and community colleges as centers of student service, so that those services did not need to exist in a strip mall disconnected from the school. They needed to exist in schools themselves, and they needed to be part of existing processes like IEP processes or other ways in which we engage families to provide the right types of services and supports for the young person right in their household. And we wanted to embed those things directly. So fast forward to today, there in Delaware, there's a tri-state agency partnership that isolates and directs supports directly to schools, specifically with the intention of supporting students with disabilities. And again, fast forward from then until now, the number of students with disabilities who are participating in completing CTE programs has risen exponentially. And we are seeing students graduate at higher rates, transition at higher rates than before. And it's great, but it took a lot of coordination, and it also took the right roles and responsibilities. So the state's role was this, and when we would essentially invest in schools to come on board with this strategy, we brought school districts along like a cohort. And then they would work together to kind of vet local policy against one another and ensure that they were creating inclusive learning environments. So it was a strong division of labor, but there's a lot that can be done here. And I think we are just scratching the surface for how we can provide support more directly.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. Now, we're a little over time, so I'm going to switch over to Kate and Heather, and we'll come back to some questions about funding. Everyone's agreed to stay a little bit longer after the 5 o'clock hour if you can join us, but we'll keep it recorded if you have to step out. But we know when we get into these conversations, the rich answers, and that was fabulous, Luke, really to hear about the depth and really commitment to disability. It's the kind of stuff we want to hear that is at our federal level as well, that passion to really supporting all of our youth. So appreciate that. But now Kate and Heather, and if you're coming in late, Kate is Executive Director of Advanced CTE. Heather Justice is Director of Career Readiness at Education Strategy Group. And together, their organizations are working on a pretty exciting, really like an ecosystem level intervention with communities. And I'm so excited to have you both talking about that. And I'm not even going to ask order. I just want to have, if you could just introduce very briefly about your organization, but then tell us about this new Skills Ready Network and what you're hoping to achieve. So who would like to jump in first? How's that for chaos?
I know, and Heather and I did not coordinate at all, which we probably should have done. Well, I don't want to introduce myself in Advanced CT, and then Heather, who is driving a lot of this, I'll let you take a first crack and I can fill in some gaps on new skills. Great.
Perfect.
So hi, everybody. I recognize a lot of the names in the chat and the participants, but for those I've not met, I'm Kate Kreamer. I'm the Deputy Executive Director at Advanced CTE, and we are the national membership organization that represents states and state leaders who oversee career technical education across the country. Our members are in all 50 states, DC, the territories, and largely sit within state agencies, community college systems, workforce development agencies. And always fun to come on calls like this and get to present with 2 former members who have now risen to, I'm not going to say bigger and better, but bigger in different roles than the state director. So Heather, I'll turn it to you.
Thanks, Kate. Yeah, it's easy to accept something when I get to talk with Kate and Luke. That's like a good part of your day, right? Hello, everyone. I'm Heather Justice. I am Director of Career Readiness at Education Strategy Group. For those who may not be familiar, we are a small consulting group who's really convinced that the the education intersection between workforce and education with high wage, high quality work experiences is what's ultimately going to lead to like a better, more equitable society. So we focus our work really around implementing high quality career pathways around the transition points of K-12, post-secondary education, and the workforce, and how those institutions can kind of scale those high quality career pathways. That's a little bit about us. We can launch into new skills, Scott, if that's helpful.
Absolutely.
So JP Morgan Chase has invested as part of their New Skills at Work program, $350 million, which is essentially kind of a bigger, more expansive phase 2 for those of us who are involved in New Skills for Youth, which was the more state-focused plan. So not shockingly, Luke was a part of that when they were in Delaware. I was a part of that when we were in Tennessee. But this is actually designed at the intersection. It's just that Kate was leading that as one of the technical assistance partners. But this is actually designed to talk about the intersection at the state level and the local level. So we have 6 communities as a part of the project. I'll go in order: Boston, alphabetical, Boston, Massachusetts, Columbus, Ohio, Dallas, Texas, Denver, Colorado, Indianapolis, Indiana, and then Nashville, Tennessee. And really, it's about scaling high quality career pathways across 4 priority areas that should sound very aligned to you based off of work that Luke was talking about. 1, high quality career pathways is priority 1. The second is seamless post-secondary transitions, so advising, dual enrollment. The third is high quality work-based learning experiences embedded throughout. And then the fourth is actually equity, and specifically closing equity gaps. And so I really liked what Luke was saying earlier about equity being a design principle, because it really is where we started the conversation and kind of continue to push around credentials, access, persistence, enrollment, completion, all of those different pieces, and really looking at what that looks like for different subsets. Kate, what did I leave out from the 60,000 foot?
No, I think that was that was a great overview. And I think just in terms of, we have been working with ESG, the 2 organizations were supporting the first kind of investment in New Skills for Youth. As mentioned, investment in 10 states that kind of were building systems at the state level. And kind of at the pivot point, I think JPMC was interested in what does it like to build a local ecosystem. States are still part of this. The state, as we'll talk about, kind of the agencies are still at the table to think about what's the policy infrastructure that needs to be at the state level, what's the learning at the local level, and what's that feedback loop between the 2. Really hard, haven't fully cracked it, but really interesting design principle. So that is the shift. And I think the other piece that I'll say, which is remarkable about this investment, is that it's for 5 years. And that is not something that philanthropy does. They don't invest in 5-year initiative to give these sites the time they need to build and change the system. We talk about systems building, systems change all the time, but we never really give like communities and states the time to do that. And so that's something that is really remarkable, especially given this work was announced in February 2020. There was a big plan to do this very inclusive and expansive needs assessment process with focus groups and interviews with learners and industry and all the partners. And obviously that really all shifted in terms of kind of the needs of the system were so acute in that time between March and kind of October 2020, when we really launched the work and moved beyond the needs assessment process. So it kind of both gave that time, but also at a really kind of challenging but hypercritical time to really take stock of what was working and where they needed to go as a system.
Kate, I'd love to unpack a little bit with you what strategies you all use to help communities identify career pathways that were both high demand and the industry needs, and were also high wage, so they met students' needs as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we just really briefly, we mentioned state, local, so kind of in each, just the way that each site, it's a little bit different, but kind of in each site, there's a backbone intermediate organization that is kind of the lead, right? That is kind of organizing this, whether that's a Chamber of Commerce in Nashville, a workforce development board in Indianapolis, kind of other organizations like that. Then you have the districts, you have a 2-year partner, at least 1 2-year institution, at least 1 4-year institution. And then as well as in some cases got philanthropy, other community-based organizations, mayor's offices at the table, And then, as I mentioned, those state level agencies, whether it looks different, but minimally kind of the state education agency, and some you've got workforce and post-secondary at the table as well. So I think there's kind of two tracks of this, right? There's like the easier alignment, which is still hard, which is labor market alignment. And that's where I think we've seen generally across the system, not just in these sites, kind of the most movement. And Perkins 5 definitely pushes much further in terms of really putting a clear stake in the ground around that alignment to high skill, high wage, or in demand. We think it should be and. So we tell everybody it's actually an and, not an or. In these 6 sites, many already had good labor market data or analyses done, and so built on that. But what was, I think, most interesting in sites like Dallas and Indianapolis that had a lot of different partners with a lot of different labor market analyses, what they did was actually, let's come together and agree on one common definition, one common construct. I use the Dallas example a lot because they actually started with wage first and said, if it doesn't meet the threshold for high wage, then it doesn't go on the list as a priority. And then they looked at demand and looked at skill. And I think that's a really important from an equity perspective to really drive that. Now, again, you still have to look at good job. There's a lot more obviously in that construct. So where we've seen kind of them coalesce, and not a surprise, IT, manufacturing, healthcare are kind of the common sectors, because those are just going to be acute everywhere in terms of the need. The other piece of this is actually defining quality, right? And looking at what are the broader construct. What does it mean from a curricular? What does it mean from an instruction? What does it mean from an outcome perspective? So what a number of sites have done, and they've learned from each other, is actually build out some rubrics and kind of common rubrics that the secondary and post-secondary systems going to come together around common understandings of what that is and what that transition is, the handoff. So we have a common understanding of a high quality pathway from secondary into post-secondary. So a number of the sites have been using kind of this to run through and have been sharing kind of what those rubrics, what those analysis are, so that they're not reinventing the wheel. And certainly I'd say building off of a lot of the work that's done on their skills for youth, because a number of states have built out some strong constructs there.
That's awesome. So one last question before we bring Paul Perkins in to give us another perspective from the industry that really looking at needs for credentials and things like that in this space. But before that, Heather, if you're there, which I think you are, I know you came back. What would you see as like 2 or 3 of the most exciting developments that's happening within the new skills ready networks?
Yeah, can everybody hear me?
We can.
Great. Technology's perfect when it works, right?
Yeah.
So I think some of the big pieces were actually similar to what Luke was alluding to earlier. We've actually had some of our sites who've really understood and recognized the importance to drive this process down earlier into the middle school. So you have states and communities like Boston and Denver taking their individualized career and academic plans really down earlier into that middle school, and really thinking about how you effectively recruit students, how you bring them.
Oh, think we lost you, Heather. Kate, are you able to go on that strand, or do you want me to jump in?
No, I mean, I think I can. I will say this, advisement was built into both the transition, as you mentioned, those 4-part transition, as well as equity. Advising was a big part of kind of when we were breaking those pieces apart, and really what are the criteria and our look fors. But I will say at the beginning of this investment, the focus was not on advising. By end of year 1, given the pandemic, given the increased focus on equity, advisement became a much stronger priority and visible priority across all the sites, frankly, right? In terms of both pushing it down earlier, family and learner engagement to really get their voices into the mix and make sure we're understanding what their needs are, strengthening things like ICAP or ILP, whatever you might want to call it. And then also quite a few that are really focusing on that transition and what's the handoff in advising, so that when a student leaves high school and goes into post-secondary, that information follows them and there's some clear connectivity. Denver's doing some really interesting work there about having that ICAP follow the student into post-secondary, so that can be part of the conversation. Indianapolis is also doing some work around IB Tech to really have that clear trade-off, and having Nashville has their college and career coaches kind of in their focus high schools, but also working directly with Nashville State and their community college partner. So I do think advisement became kind of not surprise, but kind of at the beginning, it wasn't necessarily it was kind of a sub priority, and it really, I think, rose to a much higher priority, just given the needs, right, of our learners and of our communities at this moment in time.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right on target, that the idea that we have these great structures in place, how do we help youth and their families see the relevance and the meaningfulness and the connection to the skills and talent of the students? So really, really excited about that. Well, thank you so much. We're gonna keep talking. We're gonna bring Paul in now, and then we're gonna go back and hopefully we'll have some other points and questions from the audience as well. But we've still got some on our list as well. But Ava, why don't you take over?
Yeah, I'd love to hear from one of our founding coalition board members and also the president of Amatral, Paul Perkins. Paul, you've been a very strong advocate and support for helping youth and young adults access the credentials needed to begin working in these high demand opportunities. So you listened to the discussion with our Deputy Assistant Secretary and the efforts underway with New Skills Ready Network. So wanted to hear your thoughts about what we need in order to ensure youth and families have a clear understanding of the value of these credentials and how to access them so that they can enter high wage, high demand occupations.
Well, thank you, Ava, and it's a pleasure to be with everybody today. I'm so excited about some of the things that Luke mentioned that the DOE is doing. I think the 4 pillars in the Raising the Bar initiative just makes so much sense, and the work that Kate and Heather's organizations are doing is very exciting, especially because we're an Indiana-based corporation, or that's one of our locations. We also have operations in Texas and New Jersey, but glad to hear that Indianapolis is part of that. And I think one of the things that's so important for families is really to get information. And I think Luke mentioned earlier about the importance of career coaching and advising and going beyond counseling. And I think that's just a critical element that we're missing nationally right now, is that there's so much information that families need to have that they're just not getting right now because we don't have the capacity. And one of them, I think, is to understand more the value of high quality credentials. And as Robin mentioned in the chat, credentials can be short-term certifications, they can be degrees, diplomas. People don't really understand, I think, the differences between those and how they play a role. Our company, Amatral, we make learning systems for technical education, and that means we build hands-on training equipment and e-learning courses for that colleges, universities, high schools, middle schools use to teach various types of technical skills. And one of the things that we started doing years ago was to align our programs with certifications because we've been working in the academic space for a long time and preparing programs that would support a course that would go into a degree or diploma. But as certifications started to become widely used, we aligned our programs with those. And so we've gotten to know them really quite well. And I'm a big advocate for short-term certifications because as Luke said, one of the things that's important is that education and learning is cumulative. And I know that having been out in the work world for a long time, that what you learn in school is a small part of what you're going to have to learn throughout your career. And if you can have learning that's cumulative and can be documented, that you've accumulated these things and build on top of it, it can really help you in your career. And that's where certifications, I think, have a lot of value because they can be stackable. So somebody could get a certification at one level and then go to work, and then they may go back to school and get another certification that can build on top of that. And being able to continue to advance your learning and be able to actually communicate that to an employer, I think, is a pretty important thing. And so a lot of schools today are actually blending short-term certifications with academic courses. So they're embedding them into the academic programs, and essentially the certifications are actually creating a Rosetta Stone for the educational world, because previously when a high school would develop a CTE course, it was devilishly difficult to get the college or even the university to create articulation. And when they did it, everybody jumped up and down, but it often took a significant amount of time because people would have disagreements about what needed to actually be in the course and how comparable they were. But when a high school embeds a short-term certification from an industry recognized, nationally developed certification, then if the college is using that same certification, then they have a way of being able to translate the course at the high school to the course at the college, and I have seen that break down so many different barriers, and it's just been extremely helpful. And I think also another thing that's kind of interesting that's happening in the world today is that there's a big move in short-term certifications towards actually delivering them in a series of shorter modules that some people call micro credentials. And the beauty of that is that rather than having to go through maybe a year's worth of work or 6 months, of which some people would consider to be short term, they may get it in a matter of 20, 30, 40 hours, maybe 50 hours of learning, essentially within a typical course. And so the student gets a certification, and they have they feel the achievement, the rapid achievement of getting these credentials. And so if they can keep building these up into what might ultimately be an occupational certification, they have I think a foundation and a system that allows them to get to a very high place, but every step along the way, they're getting rapid feedback that they're accomplishing something that has a lot of value. And I think that's where families today need more information about the way that pathways can be delivered, because I think if they saw that, they would see that career and technical education is not an alternative to other types of education. It's just part of a continuum.
That's awesome. Paul, that's fantastic. And I just want to, give the personal experience I've had with you and the organization and the support. Jennifer Watkins here from Massachusetts and runs our innovation pathways. And as a result, I was able to work with my high school and needed to know, how do we go from an interest in advanced manufacturing to those kinds of credentials and training? And Paul, within an hour, you had a contact for us who came in, and it was just magic to see this investment, this advocacy and support to help the school right where they're at get to the next phase of what they needed to do in development. It was patient, it was encouraging, it was fantastic. So really the work you do with Amitral and the kind of support systems is really fantastic, and just wanted to call you out for that. It's really a great resource for everyone. So here's our plan. We're going to kind of transition now into some Q&A. We've got a couple of comments in. While we're doing that, Luke, I wanted to recognize a couple of your former colleagues. Terry Lawler's here, and Terry, I don't know if you know, she won a big award from Castle for the work she's doing around bringing SEL into this whole spectrum of the personalized career and academic plans, as well as the CTE work. So happy to see Karen Keegan here as well. So you got your fan base from Delaware on, and I may have missed some others, but those are the ones I saw just in the quick look, but wanted to call you out. We've got a great number of our state leaders who've been with us along the ride around these topics. And so I'm hoping they're going to jump in as well. Now, those of you that are new to us, you just have to understand, we call you out, and we've got Wally here who's going to bring you right up to talk with Luke and Heather and Cade and Paul around any follow-up questions and thoughts you might have. And we did have one that I wanted to bring in. And before we do it, this is one that came in from, let me get her name so I don't mess it up. Oh, I lost it. Where'd it go? Anyway, I'll get that in a moment. But it had to do with community organizations being involved in some of the delivery and some question. It was a specific question around that. So we'll get you up. But I wanted, Luke, just to talk a little bit about funding. Something that's come up a lot is Perkins really is advancing down to the middle school, but also the whole personalized career and academic plan strategy. You heard it called ICAP, ILP. Nationally, it comes by many different names. That there's money there that we can support the whole system in being able to understand the value in nature. So again, we're talking about pathways with all youth, whether it's a traditional, concrete career tech ed pathway. We're all looking at pathways from early college and everything else. And there's been some anxiety around what means supplanting, dollars around this. And we're just trying to get it understood, because we've got some nervous state leaders around wanting to advocate, and I've got laughter going on because this has been a 2-3 year conversation about, can we use the Perkins dollars that way, like Massachusetts is doing, to get all schools involved in this, or when and where and how can we use this in this larger perspective? As you heard Kate and Heather talk about, career advising is realizing now it's such a centerpiece to all of this work. And we can't get any of it done if we don't have a good advising system. So I've given you enough context, I think, but what are your thoughts around the funding?
Yeah, so I mean, the short answer is yes, you should use federal and state and local dollars to support young people to progress in their career and college journey. That is the short answer. What Scott, the reason I'm laughing is the idea of braiding funds is like one of the questions that I get most frequently. And I think it's an interesting question, and there is apprehension, and I appreciate sincerely that most people in education are rule followers. And what I would say is do in fact follow the rules, but here's where I would push. So in most pieces of federal law, right, you have things that say permissive use of funds, required use of funds, and non-permissive use of funds. You know, most people look at it from, unless it's expressly stated in the law that I can spend money on A, B, and C, I will not spend federal money on A, B, and C. I would offer the counterfactual to that. Unless it expressly says you can't, you can probably figure it out within the permissive and required use of funds. So you have considerably more flexibility than I think we give ourselves in terms of how we look at the application of federal dollars. And things like student advisement, things like being able to braid federal funds for students with disabilities. This is absolutely what we should be doing at the local, state, and national level.
So how do we help them with that anxiety? Do they call you up and say, hey, we want to do this? Or has there been any states that have been found guilty of using money to help youth? I'm just trying to figure out what's happening in the danger zone, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, so we have a team that does like our monitoring and stuff like that. And people are particularly fearful about like what happens if I get a monitoring finding. The answer is if you get a monitoring finding, similar from the federal government to your state, and I've done monitoring at both levels now, which is fun. It's written up in a letter. And you essentially are asked to correct that behavior, right? Like that's what happens. That is not insurmountable in terms of a feedback loop. So, you know, I really think, again, if you're putting young people at the center of your financial decision making, and you are aware of the different types of dollars that you have at your disposal, and you are building a plan around the financial use of funds relative to the activity that you want to accomplish, 9 times out of 10, you're fine. Right. And I think like this would be my encouragement to think a little bit more creatively with uses of funds. And again, unless it expressly says no, do you know what I mean? You should explore it.
Great. No, thank you. And I was looking for just a yes answer, but it's still more complex than that. But that's okay. I appreciate that. Well, I'm hoping that Karen Gutman's going to come off and we can bring her up. She's got a question specifically about some of the organization engagement in this space. So, Karen, did you want to ask your question?
Sure. Just as I did that, am I unmuted? Yes.
Yes.
My phone started ringing.
Perfect timing, of course.
I'm from the nonprofit world, and sometimes we feel like we're left out of that conversation. We serve people with barriers and help in a lot with guidance towards educational certifications and such. And yet it often seems that the nonprofit world is left out of some of that funding that's coming from the government. And I wondered if you could address that.
Sure. So I think one of the things that we are kind of as a country talking about right now is how to essentially connect in school and out of school learning. And this is also true within the context of college and career advisement and all kinds of different things. But there is, you know, Karen, to your point, a specific set aside of ARP funds that are really used to look at like out of school learning experiences and to connect those things with, you know, school-based instruction and student support services and other things along those lines. So it's really around the program and the type of experience that you want to create for young people. And there are dedicated resources for this. So one that comes to mind is 21st Century Learning Grants, which is federal to states and localities. Oftentimes, community and nonprofit organizations are the recipients of those 21st century learning grants. So an example in the state of Delaware, one of the biggest recipients is the United Way of Delaware, which is the largest state nonprofit that administers that funds with, I think there are 9 additional community partners. So there are resources in this space. There is an earmark in ARP funds that's specifically intended to do this. And I think the way that we help young people is not just by focusing on in-school instruction. It is about the connection between in-school and out-of-school experiences, whether that's after school, before school, summer learning, whether that's the alignment of work-based learning in this space, or that's dedicated programming. Like, this is how we help young people reach their fullest potential. That's my 2 cents.
Fantastic. Fantastic. So I'm going to ask Brian Albrecht to come, if you want to bring him up, Wally, to see if he would like to make some comments as our one of our leaders on our CCD board. And he's and just got an award from ACTE for his lifelong work in and he's really at the 2-year college level. So I'm hoping maybe, Brian, you can kind of reflect on this as we kind of move from the high school into the 2-year, what you've heard and what you find exciting about the, I'm assuming it's exciting about what you've heard today.
Well, absolutely, Scott, and thank you. And first of all, just thank all of our panelists. This has been a really important discussion, and I think helps set the stage for our continued growth at the CCD and, of course, across the nation in our schools. I've always felt that there's been this sort of missing connection between our K-12 pathway structure and our community or post-secondary pathway structure. And they both are pathways that are important to all learners, no matter what age they are. And the more we can align and connect and figure out ways to help educate all citizens on their opportunities, we'll build a stronger and more robust economy for our local communities and, of course, for our nation. So, Luke, I want to thank you, first of all, for your leadership in Washington, D.C. It's so important. It was great to see you at the ACTE conference, and you probably felt the energy as well, 6,000 people out there. So a lot of people are talking about what you're discussing today as an important and critical key asset to the strength of building a stronger educational system for our nation. And really proud of the leadership that everyone's continuing to provide, moving our country forward. But I think about what's happening in advanced CTE and helping build collaborative spirit between all of the states so that we can align our systems and create more efficiencies. And I know that the Education Strategy Group is continually finding best practices to help educate all of us, whether it's at the state level or at the local level, to make better use of the resources that are available to us. So today's discussion is critical for us. It kind of leads into our board meeting for our CCD as we continue to develop a foundation of awareness of these movements and the importance of those strategic directions that Luke identified that the Department of Education is working toward. And anything we can do to help support and build capacity for that is really what the focus of our mission is. So again, Scott, thank you, and thank Ava for the leadership in bringing these opportunities to our audience. And Paul, as always, your continued support. It's important to have an employer perspective. And I know that Paul is working very hard in Indiana with the governor's office to begin to institute some of these ideas so that they become a part of the fabric. And we're not just talking about good ideas, we're actually implementing those ideas. So thanks to everyone for being with us today.
Thank you. And I know Luke is going to need to jump off in a moment. We are just amazed that you could give us this much time given your busy schedule, Luke. And honestly, it's just so exciting to be able to have our federal government talking openly, being engaging, and also for us to really learn just how intimate these issues are for you personally as you're working on our behalf. So really thank you for all of the work you're doing, and are looking forward to watching and seeing more of these great activities happening. So I want to also, I want to see if we could, Wally, could you bring Meredith Bird online here? And then we're going to go to Julia. Julia's going to come in as well, Julia Renfro from Alaska. But I wanted to, Meredith, you were really interested in kind of the how do we learn more about this whole career advising foundation piece? And I know we've got some things at the CCD Center, but I know ESG and Advanced ACT have been thinking and talking about these issues as well. So I wanted you to talk with them directly and see what they might have to offer in this space.
Yeah, thank you so much. I hope you can all hear me okay. I work with a company that focuses on CCR, especially with small communities throughout the country, but specifically I'm thinking of a region in Texas that I work with that is pretty isolated. And they have been able to purchase our product through the use of Perkins funds. So I was really interested to hear about that, and also specifically how to branch out into focusing on students with disabilities and making sure they're getting included in that conversation. But also one of the things they focus on is effective advising product, or EAF. And so I wanted to hear a little bit about what kinds of things you would recommend me, so I could share with them about how to make sure they're building an effective advising program for those students.
I see Heather and Kate are jumping at answering that question.
I'm actually going to clarify a connection point and make sure my internet stays. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, great. I'm going to turn off my video just
Okay.
to be safe. Sorry. So you say EAF in Texas. Are you talking about the effective advising framework that they're implementing out there with their districts?
Yes, that's correct. Yeah.
Got you. Yeah, I think my answer is going to be similar to Luke answers, but from more of a state perspective. I think it's just each community has such a wealth of resources and advising that they may not understand how much they have to offer. And so I really think asset mapping is just crucial. I think there's things that the Texas Education Agency supports out there around the effective advising framework. There's grants that the TEA will give out, but I also think there's frankly just programs that they have at the school level, like communities and schools and others that likely have touch points here or providing services to kind of connect the dots. So I do think it's more of like a braided approach. Each community will be different in where they've spent their funding, and more specifically, I think, the question of supplanting came up because people want to use their federal dollars to support this, and I think that's fine. But thinking about what the schools have available in terms of federal and community and state, the likely intersection in each place is going to be some sort of combination of those, and they likely already have some assets and programs to connect to this work too. That's my 60,000-foot answer, and then knowing enough to be dangerous about the Texas context.
That's awesome. Anything, Kate, to add? You're good? Okay.
I would agree. Ditto.
All right. Well, fantastic. So why don't we have one more question or one more person that would like to come in and make a comment. So if we could get Julia Renfro up and let her make a comment or add a question into this whole thing. What's exciting about Julia, she's been with us for a long time now as a state leader, but it's coming from Alaska. And so the whole issue of this, talk about rural times 1,000, right, in terms of how they're designing programs. And so we always like to kind of bring that perspective in when we can. But Julia, what would you like to talk about?
Oh, good afternoon. It actually is here now. Thanks to everyone who spoke today and the thoughts that were in the comments. Here in Alaska, we are really taking a look at how cultural identity works with our career and technical education. We try to stay away from language that says things like the real world or the business world, that kind of thing. It's not, that language is not received well across the state. Only 25% of our state is actually on the road system. So 75% is out in that very rural area where you can only fly into it. You might be able to boat, or you guys would say take a snowmobile, but we would say take a snow machine out to get to these locations. But cultural identity, when we're creating self-advocates with their personal academic and career plans, we call them personal learning and career plans here in Alaska. That's been a major piece. And you can imagine when we're talking about WIOA funding, when we're talking about Perkins funding, those kinds of things, being able to stretch that out when you say, okay, well, it's going to be, per capita number of students involved in a program. In rural Alaska, they struggle to have 10 high school students in order to have a high school. Mm-hmm. And so in order to bring career and technical opportunities out to those areas, it's very difficult. So they end up bringing students into residential schools. They end up bringing, which again takes away from cultural identity. And they also will bring out different pieces for intensives. But when you have very large equipment, being able to transport that around the state by airplane or whatever means is very difficult to do as well. So what we have taken to do is have regional collaboration. So while we have very few school districts, those school districts have a lot of schools within them, very spread apart. And they collaborate on industry and Native Alaskan corporations and associations that are in those areas to help support them. But our Career and Technical Education, our Association of Career and Technical Education has created, kind of incubated an education exchange. And so we are sharing lesson plans, we are sharing ideas across the grades, pre-K through post-secondary, industry, CTE, core classes, special education, counseling, I might have said that already, across the board, what's working in each of our career clusters, what's working in our specific neck of the woods. And so we can sort that by regions. We have discussion groups that we can get to online. We also have very high turnover of educators in Alaska, really trying to work on growing our own, but it's very high turnover in educators and counselors.
Yeah.
And so when putting those ideas out there, that's what we've been seeing. So it's taken us a number of years. We have been taking the education exchange and getting people logged in, getting them feel comfortable with that at all of the conferences this last conference season. Everyone, nothing but favorable words. It was an idea that we got from California. And we're able to get some people to help us make it our own here in Alaska. So if we've got a small engines class happening in one village, then someone who just picked up, who's never been anywhere near small engines, but is the dedicated CTE teacher, can pick up that lesson and see how can they make it work for them in their village as well.
Right. Yeah. And I was wondering, Paul, if you might have any thoughts on that. I mean, I know that as I'm looking, as I was walking through the ACT aisle, whole lot of stuff going on around equipment and ideas, things that youth can be working on to learn the different skills, but also, as we talked about earlier, the VR. And I know in Alaska, we have issues. We don't always have all the connectivity, but we do have some connectivity in places to be able to do that. But any thoughts in terms of how we can expose, say, Alaskan Native youth to those kinds of skill sets that are going to be responsive to their local community needs?
Well, Scott, I think it's an all of the above situation. Certainly starting with work-based learning is an ideal way for students to experience things firsthand. And I think that's really helpful, but it's not possible to probably experience every opportunity. And that's where the opportunities that can be placed into the classroom really make a lot of sense. And I think a combination of VR and real world hands-on equipment is probably the ideal approach. And a lot of students today, you certainly find things like virtual reality very, very appealing, but some students have a hard time connecting with what the real thing is through VR. And so actually having experiences with real world stuff, that there's a tactile feedback is really important for those students. So like Luke was saying, there just isn't a one-size-fits-all strategy, but it's a combination of these strategies. And one place where I find that virtual reality is a great complement to hands-on is where a school might be able to afford one piece of equipment, but they can have an entire class experience that piece of equipment with VR, and they can support the training for it. And that's I think a direction that I see a lot of schools going to today is to try and combine those things and try and find as many opportunities to get students into work-based learning as possible.
Fantastic. And Kate, you had some thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, we're partnering with Southern Regional Education Board and the Western Interstate Commission of Higher Education, two of kind of the education compacts to explore how do we actually expand CT and work-based learning without borders, right? This geographic barriers that industry doesn't see, that has long been a real challenge for students in rural and frontier states. Obviously, Alaska is the extreme situation where you can only get to certain schools by plane. That is an extreme, but this is not a new challenge, right? That students have only had access to the things that are in their community when we want to be exposing them to a much broader. Coming back to the earlier conversation about the importance of middle school and creating that cultural identity and that occupational identity. And if you're only seeing 2 careers in your community, then you're really limiting opportunity. This is a hard piece because it comes back to funding, comes back to accountability. When you're moving beyond sharing ideas, sharing lessons plans, but actually opening up access in new ways and creating opportunities for students to engage in coursework within and across their state, it's really challenging, but I think there is more will there than there has been in the past, in part because we saw that a lot of things virtually can work and remote can work. And frankly, if we're preparing students for the world of work, this is the world of work for many careers now, right? Is being able to do work remotely and be able to engage kind of not in a face-to-face. So I think it's really important as we think about some of those more durable skills or professional skills that we're building, having that in there. So we'll be doing some more research interviews. We've done a bunch of roundtables to really get a sense of what is happening, but also blue sky, what this could look like. I think the other thing in Alaska that's just what we did some work that wrapped up this summer, working with Alaska around recruiting students. And I think just one thing I want to know, and I'm so glad that Julia kind of spoke, because it is such a different perspective. And we've done a bunch of communications research and how to best message CTE to students and families. And our messages didn't resonate there because it is such a unique cultural situation where talking about real world skills was, they wanted to focus on community. And so they actually really did the work to modify that, to really think about what they can be doing at the middle school level. They created a course for counselors for 8th grade to be kind of embedded wherever, to really have that conversation about career exposure, career awareness, understand what CT is, but did it in a very different, unique, and authentic way. So I just want to commend that and just the unique challenges.
Fantastic. So Julia wanted to do a quick follow-up, and then after that, Heather, you were going to respond to Erie's question. So that'll be fantastic. So Julia?
Yeah, and so yeah, while we are trying to stay away from using words like real world work, we are looking at in and around our post-secondary planning, and many of these locations are working off of the word just escaped me. I haven't had any caffeine yet today. Subsistence lifestyle. So, whaling, fishing, hunting, berry picking, those things that when you look at your federal programs and you think migrant education, that's very much the kind of things that are happening here. And so we're also looking at how we can make that a CTE pathway for these areas, not just at the native leadership pathway, but the skills that they're learning in their particular areas from their elders and that kind of thing. How are those the transferable skills, the things that they need to have moving forward? And the idea that we try to bring in is how are they going to be a successful participant, an active participant in their community going forward to support elders, the land, the resources, and the kids coming behind them too. So
Fantastic.
Thanks this morning, guys.
Thank you. All right. Heather, did you want to respond to Erie's? And I think we're going to close up. So this will be great. Thank you, everyone, for all your comments and the questions and everything going on. It's been a fantastic conversation. Heather?
Yeah, thanks. I think that hates me when I talk. The key in the STEM conversation and how you kind of move away from CTE, I think, is like really about industry and credentials, right? So if you still kind of keep it tied to what the students are engaging in, don't let the industry disengage, right? Like even if this turns into like an academic science facing program, if you can keep employers at the table and then tie that to some form of high quality stackable credential at the end, or even an associate degree, et cetera, there's still that clear pathway. And I think this is where this blurring the lines is really important between academically taught pathways versus career technical education taught pathways. And I wish there wasn't this difference between the two and that they just kind of all fell within career pathways and there wasn't the distinction. And yet our systems like teacher licensing, et cetera, make that kind of impossible. But just doubling down on, if you keep the employers a part of that conversation, and that really the possibility there of the teacher who's teaching that to get additional resources, whether that's just content knowledge, et cetera, from your employers, is really what I would double down on. And then what is it the students are earning at the end, right? It can't just be a couple of courses that they're taking, but what are they showing as success? And that pathway can really be what you can bring to the table there.
There you go. All right.
I want to thank all of you for being here today, and thank you so much for your insight. Heather, even though we can't see you right now, we heard you loud and clear. We really appreciate your sharing with Kate, some of the amazing work you're doing with the New Skills Ready Network and also out in the field. Thank you to our board member, Paul Perkins, for giving us a really unique insight into what it looks like to use VR technologies and other technologies to expose students to career pathways they have never thought of before. Thank you to Deputy Assistant Secretary Luke Rhine, who was here with us earlier, to our board chair, Brian Albrecht, for popping on, and to our State Leaders Network in the audience, like Julie Renfro and others on the call, to our staff, Robin and Scott, our VP, to our BU friends, and to our sponsors, American Student Assistance and Education Strategies Group. We appreciate this conversation. It's ongoing, and we look forward to seeing you at our next policy forum.
And look forward to hearing more as this New Skills Network keeps going. So we'll have you all back, as I know you've got a lot happening, and it's just exciting to see it all evolving. So thank you, Heather and Kate, for all of this great work you're doing. All right, everybody. Thank you.